I hadn't seen my Aunt Vanessa in over 5 years. The last holiday dinner we attended together had ended with her typical backhanded compliments that stung long after I'd driven home. She'd cornered me by the dessert table, champagne flute in hand, designer bracelet jingling as she gestured toward my simple dress. "You know, Emily, some makeup and better clothes would really help your career prospects. Men notice these things." I'd nodded politely, swallowed my pride, and excused myself before I could say something I'd regret. Last I heard, Vanessa was still climbing the social ladder in Boston, showing up at charity events just to be photographed next to people who mattered. Her Instagram was a carefully curated gallery of power lunches at Duave, front row seats at Symphony Hall, and summer weekends in Nantucket. The caption beneath each photo might as well have read, "Look how important I am." When I received the invitation to a high-level corporate summit at the Hilton downtown, I didn't expect to run into her. The crisp white envelope arrived at my office on a Tuesday morning, the silver embossed logo of Tech Fusion catching the light as I turned it over in my hands. To me, it was just another negotiation, another deal to close for my firm. But later that evening, while reviewing the attendee list over a glass of Cabernet in my apartment, my heart skipped a beat when I saw her name. Vanessa Reynolds, Marketing Director, Bluestream Solutions. I nearly spilled my wine. Bluestream was one of the tech companies involved in our merger deal. Of course Vanessa would work there. She always had a knack for attaching herself to rising stars. I set the list down and walked to my window, gazing out at the Boston skyline. The city lights twinkled back at me, indifferent to my sudden anxiety. Vanessa had always looked down on me. When I worked as a secretary fresh out of Northeastern, she made it her mission to remind everyone in the family that I was still answering phones. At Thanksgiving dinner, she'd ask loudly across the table, "Still taking messages for the big shots, Emily?" The table would fall silent, my mother would shoot me an apologetic glance, and I'd force a smile while cutting my turkey into unnecessarily small pieces. The job market is tough, I'd say, knowing no explanation would satisfy her. I remember every sarcastic remark, every judgmental glance at family dinners. The Christmas when she gifted me, "How to Win Friends and Influence People," with a note that read, "This might help you move up from the reception desk." The 4th of July barbecue where she cornered my parents to express her concern that I was wasting my potential. To her, success meant power suits, luxury bags, and being the loudest voice in the room. I didn't care for her approval back then, and I certainly didn't need it now. I took another sip of wine and flipped through the rest of the summit materials. This wasn't just any meeting. It was the final round of a $70 million merger deal between my company, Apex Ventures, and two major tech giants, Bluestream Solutions and NextGen Technologies. After months of preparation, countless late nights, and 3 preliminary rounds of talks, we were finally approaching the finish line. I was the lead negotiator, and what Vanessa didn't know, what no one in the family knew, was that I was no longer a secretary. I hadn't been for years. After 2 promotions at my old firm, I'd been headhunted by Apex. I had built my own path in silence, climbing the corporate ladder while my family still thought I was answering phones somewhere. It wasn't that I was hiding my success, I just stopped trying to prove myself to people who'd already made up their minds about me. The summit was scheduled for next Tuesday, giving me a week to prepare. I spent the following days rehearsing my presentation, reviewing financial projections, and consulting with our legal team on the finer points of the contract. By Monday night, I had memorized every number, anticipated every possible objection, and developed counter-strategies for any negotiation roadblock we might encounter. In my bedroom, I laid out my outfit for the next day, a tailored navy suit that had cost me a month's salary but was worth every penny. Next to it, I placed my leather portfolio, a gift from my team after our last successful acquisition. Inside was a Mont Blanc pen my boss had given me when I was promoted to lead negotiator. "For signing deals that change the game," he'd said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, imagining scenarios of how the meeting might go, how Vanessa might react when she saw me. Would she try to undermine me? Would she pretend we weren't related? Or would she try to use our connection to gain an advantage in the negotiations? None of these scenarios mattered in the end. I was prepared, competent, and had earned my place at that table. This summit was about to become the perfect stage for a silent, elegant revenge, one where I wouldn't have to say a word. My work would speak for itself. As dawn broke over the Boston harbor, I showered, dressed, and made myself a strong cup of coffee. Looking in the mirror as I applied a subtle layer of makeup, I barely recognized the confident woman staring back at me. She was a far cry from the insecure girl who used to dread family gatherings. This version of Emily stood tall, knew her worth, and was about to close the biggest deal of her career, whether Aunt Vanessa approved or not. The morning of the summit, I stepped into the Hilton's Grand Conference Hall dressed in my fitted navy suit, my portfolio tucked neatly under my arm. The familiar weight of it against my side was reassuring, like armor. I felt confident, focused. Boston's financial district hummed with activity outside, but inside the hotel, a different kind of energy prevailed. The hall buzzed with the calculated intensity of high-stake deals and strategic networking. Men and women in expensive suits clustered in small groups, their conversations a mix of industry jargon and carefully measured small talk. I recognized several faces from Forbes profiles and CNBC interviews, tech moguls and venture capitalists whose decisions shaped markets. A waiter passed by with a tray of coffee, and I took a cup, needing the caffeine to sharpen my already alert mind. "Emily," a voice called from behind me. I turned to see Mark, one of our junior analysts, hurrying toward me with a tablet in hand. "I've updated the projections based on Bluestream's latest quarterly report. Their cloud division performed even better than expected." I nodded, taking the tablet and quickly reviewing the numbers. "Good work. This gives us more leverage on the revenue-sharing model." As Mark and I discussed last-minute strategy adjustments, I felt someone watching me. It was a familiar sensation, one I'd experienced at countless family gatherings, the weight of judgment. I glanced up and scanned the room, my eyes eventually landing on a sleek figure by the refreshment table. Aunt Vanessa. She hadn't noticed me yet. She was engaged in animated conversation with two men in charcoal suits, her hands gesturing dramatically as she spoke. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a crimson blazer that stood out among the sea of navy and black, always needing to be the center of attention. "Is something wrong?" Mark asked, following my gaze. I shook my head. "No, just spotted someone I know. Let's wrap this up quickly. I want to check in with legal before we start." We finished our conversation, and Mark headed off to join the rest of our team. I considered avoiding Vanessa entirely, walking straight to the conference room to prepare. But something pulled me toward the refreshment table. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe I wanted to gauge her reaction before the meeting began. I approached casually, pouring myself another cup of coffee at the station next to where she stood. I kept my back to her, hoping to delay the inevitable for just a moment longer. But as I turned, adding a splash of cream to my cup, a familiar voice caught my attention. "Oh my God, is that you? Emily?" My aunt's voice, sharp and sweet like poisoned honey, floated through the air. She disengaged from her conversation partners and took a step toward me, her eyes widening with recognition. Her gaze traveled from my face to my suit, lingering on my portfolio with the Apex logo. Confusion flickered across her features, quickly replaced by her default expression of polite condescension. "It is you," she exclaimed, loud enough for nearby conversations to pause. "What on earth are you doing here?" She stood near the coffee station, surrounded by other well-dressed executives who were now looking our way with mild interest. "I work for Apex," I said simply, taking a sip of my coffee. "Oh!" Her eyebrows arched perfectly. "Admin department? That's wonderful that they include everyone in these big events." She turned slightly toward the men she'd been speaking with earlier, who hovered nearby. "My niece," she explained to them with an indulgent smile. "Always been a hard worker, though she's never quite found her direction." She turned back to me. "Still a secretary?" "Poor thing," she added with a condescending smile, loud enough for the others to hear. The executives exchanged glances, visibly uncomfortable with her tone. One of them, a silver-haired man I recognized as next-gen CFO, frowned slightly. I smiled politely, feeling strangely calm. 5 years ago, her words would have cut deep. Now, they barely grazed the surface. Nice to see you, Aunt Vanessa. I didn't correct her. Not yet. The moment didn't call for it. She laughed, clearly thinking she'd embarrassed me. The sound echoed hollow in the space between us. We should catch up later, she said, already turning away. I've got some connections who might be able to help you find something more substantial. She emphasized the last word like she was doing me an enormous favor. I nodded once, then excused myself to prepare for the meeting. What she didn't realize was that, in less than an hour, I'd be sitting at the head of the table, directing the very meeting she thought she was attending as a guest. As I walked away, I heard one of the executives mutter something to her. I couldn't make out his words, but her laugh in response sounded forced. The Apex team had gathered in a small preparation room adjacent to the main conference hall. Our CEO, James Wilson, looked up as I entered. There she is, he said with a grin. Ready to make history today, Emily? I set my coffee down and opened my portfolio. Absolutely. Any last concerns? He asked, his expression turning serious. James had been my mentor since I joined Apex 3 years ago, and he knew how much this deal meant for my career. None, I replied, meeting his gaze. We've prepared for every scenario. The numbers make sense for all parties, and our terms are fair. I paused. Actually, there is one thing, my aunt works for Bluestream. She's here today. James raised an eyebrow. Is that going to be a problem? I thought about Vanessa's smug expression just minutes ago, the way she tried to diminish me in front of industry leaders. No, I said firmly. Not for us anyway. He nodded, apparently satisfied with my answer. Good. Because you've earned this moment, Emily. Don't let family dynamics distract you. The team spent the next 20 minutes reviewing our strategy one final time. Our legal counsel highlighted key contract clauses, our financial analyst confirmed the final valuation numbers, and our tech specialist prepared to address any technical concerns about the integration plan. At 9:55 a.m., an assistant poked her head into the room. They're ready for you in the main conference room. James stood up and straightened his tie. All right, team. Let's do this. He turned to me. Emily, you've got the floor. We gathered our materials and filed out of the preparation room. As we approached the main conference room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a decorative mirror, shoulders back, chin up, eyes clear and focused. The woman looking back at me was not the same person who had once shrunk under Vanessa's criticism. She was someone entirely new, someone ready to lead. When the time came, I walked into the main boardroom with my team right behind me. The room fell into a respectful hush as we entered. Light poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of Boston Harbor in the distance. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, its surface dotted with water glasses, notepads, and slim laptops. The room was lined with executives and CEOs, powerful men and women who had flown in from across the world for this moment. At the center of the table was my nameplate in elegant script, Emily Chin, lead negotiator, Apex Ventures. I moved toward it with purpose, aware of every eye in the room following my progress. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor as I set my portfolio down and adjusted my blazer. I surveyed the room briefly, nodding at familiar faces from previous negotiation rounds, just in time to see Vanessa walk in. She was engaged in conversation with Bluestream CEO, David Parker, apparently not having noticed me yet. Her crimson blazer stood out among the darker suits as she laughed at something Parker said, her hand touching his arm with practiced familiarity. She looked completely in her element, exactly where she always imagined herself to be, among the elite, among decision-makers. Then her eyes swept across the room and landed on me. Her expression froze mid-smile. She glanced around, clearly trying to understand what was going on. Her eyes darted from me to my nameplate, then to James Wilson, who was taking his seat beside me. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by confusion. Parker gestured toward the table, saying something I couldn't hear. Vanessa nodded automatically, her lips parted, but no sound came out. She blinked once, twice, Then she sat near the back, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. To anyone else, she might have seemed merely thoughtful, but I recognized the tight set of her jaw, the slight furrow between her eyebrows, signs of internal chaos I'd seen whenever things didn't go her way at family gatherings. I turned my attention to the task at hand. This wasn't about Vanessa. It was about closing a deal that would cement my position at Apex and potentially change the trajectory of my career. I organized my notes, reviewed the agenda one last time, and waited as the room settled. At precisely 10 a.m., James cleared his throat and stood. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this final round of negotiations. As CEO of Apex Ventures, I'm excited about the possibilities this merger represents." He gestured toward me. "I'll now turn the floor over to Emily Chin, our lead negotiator, who has been instrumental in bringing us to this point." A polite round of applause followed as I rose to my feet. From the corner of my eye, I could see Vanessa shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Thank you, James," I began, my voice clear and steady. "And thank you all for being here today. Over the past 3 months, we've made significant progress in designing a merger that benefits all parties involved. Today, we'll address the remaining points of negotiation and, hopefully, finalize an agreement that positions all 3 companies for strong future growth." I outlined the agenda, breaking down our schedule for the day, discussion of valuation models in the morning, integration strategies before lunch, and contract finalization in the afternoon. As I spoke, I could feel Vanessa's eyes on me. She had come here expecting to see the same quiet, obedient girl she used to mock. Instead, she was witnessing the transformation she never saw coming. "Now, let's begin with the revised valuation model," I continued, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. "Based on the concerns raised in our last meeting, we've adjusted our approach to better reflect Bluestream's intellectual property assets and NextGen's market position." For the next hour, I guided the discussion through complex financial projections, answering questions and addressing concerns with confidence. When David Parker challenged our revenue forecast, I calmly walked him through our methodology, pointing out market trends he'd overlooked. When NextGen's CFO expressed hesitation about the proposed equity distribution, I offered a compromise that protected their interests while maintaining the deal's overall structure. "What about the R&D integration timeline?" asked a voice from the back of the room. Vanessa had finally spoken, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Bluestream has concerns about rushing the process." All eyes turned to her, then back to me. This was the first direct interaction between us in the meeting and Anise, now business adversaries. I met her gaze steadily. "A valid concern, Ms. Reynolds. If you'll turn to page 17 in your packet, you'll see we've allocated an additional 3 months for R&D integration, with specific milestones to ensure quality control throughout the process." She flipped through her packet, clearly not having reviewed it thoroughly. "I see," she said after a moment. "And what guarantees do we have that these milestones will be met?" "The contract includes penalty clauses for missed deadlines," I replied smoothly. "But more importantly, we've designed the integration team to include equal representation from all 3 companies. This ensures shared responsibility and prevents any one party from controlling the timeline." Parker nodded approvingly. "That addresses our primary concern, Emily." "Well thought out." "Thank you, David," I said. "We understand how critical R&D is to Bluestream's brand identity. We want to preserve that value, not dilute it." Vanessa remained silent after that, watching as I continued to lead the discussion. Her initial shock had given way to something else, something I couldn't quite identify. Was it grudging respect? Resentment? Or simply the realization that she had severely underestimated me all these years? As the morning session progressed, I felt a growing sense of control, not just over the meeting, but over my own narrative. For years, I'd allowed Vanessa's perception of me to exist unchallenged. I'd avoided family gatherings, declined to share my professional achievements, and let her believe I was still answering phones somewhere. Not out of shame, but because proving her wrong had seemed like giving her too much power. Yet here we were, in a room where my competence spoke for itself, where my voice carried weight not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I had earned the right to be heard. Let's take a 15-minute break before diving into the integration strategies, I announced as we reached the end of the valuation discussion. Coffee and refreshments are available in the lobby. As people stood and stretched, engaging in casual conversation, I gathered my notes and reviewed the next section of the presentation. From across the room, I could see Vanessa in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Parker. She gestured emphatically while he looked increasingly uncomfortable, occasionally glancing my way. James approached me, a cup of coffee in hand. "You're knocking it out of the park," he said quietly. "Parker just told me he's impressed with how thoroughly you've addressed their concerns." I smiled. "Thanks. We've still got the integration hurdles to clear, but I think we're in good shape." "And your aunt?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I couldn't help noticing the tension. I glanced over at Vanessa, who was now standing alone, typing furiously on her phone. "She's processing," I said simply. It's not every day you discover that someone you've underestimated for years is actually leading a $70 million merger negotiation. James chuckled. "Well, she picked the wrong person to underestimate. Let's finish this strong." As the break ended and people returned to their seats, I caught Vanessa looking at me with an unreadable expression. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. I gave her a small, professional nod, neither hostile nor overly familiar. Just an acknowledgement that we were both here, doing our jobs. She returned the nod after a brief hesitation, and in that simple exchange, something shifted. The past didn't disappear, but it receded slightly, making room for a new reality, one where I wasn't defined by her perception of me. As the negotiation escalated in the afternoon session, I took control with precision. The morning's discussion of valuations and basic structure had set the stage, but now came the real challenges, hammering out the details that would make or break the merger. The room had grown warmer, jackets draped over chairbacks, sleeves rolled up as we delved into the complex work of reconciling three corporate cultures and business models. The proposed leadership structure creates redundancies in the marketing division, David Parker pointed out, leaning forward in his chair. Bluestream has invested heavily in building our brand identity. We can't afford to dilute that. All eyes turned to me for a response. From her seat, Vanessa straightened slightly, no doubt concerned about her own position within the restructured company. "You're right to be protective of Bluestream's marketing success," I acknowledged. "Which is why we're proposing what we call a federated model." I clicked to the next slide, displaying an organizational chart. Core operations would be integrated immediately for cost efficiency, but customer-facing divisions, including marketing, would maintain separate brand identities for the first 18 months post-merger. Parker nodded slowly, considering the proposal. "And after 18 months? A gradual transition based on performance metrics we'd established jointly," I explained. "The purpose isn't to dismantle what works, but to identify best practices across all three companies and implement them systematically." Years of studying business strategy, psychology, and market trends paid off as I navigated these delicate negotiations. My approach wasn't confrontational or domineering. Instead, I presented projections based on solid research, highlighted risk management strategies, and proposed solutions that respected each company's strengths while addressing their vulnerabilities. NextGen CEO Catherine Liu, who had been relatively quiet until now, joined the conversation. "My concern is talent retention. Engineering teams don't always respond well to corporate restructuring." I had anticipated this concern. "Absolutely right, Catherine. If I could direct everyone to Appendix C, you'll find our retention strategy, which includes targeted incentives for key personnel." I walked them through the plan, emphasizing how we'd created a bridge between different corporate cultures. "This is impressive work," Lou admitted. "You've clearly done your homework." My confidence wasn't loud, it was undeniable. As I addressed each concern methodically, I could see the mood in the room shifting from cautious skepticism to cautious optimism. These weren't just industry veterans, they were billionaires, people who had built empires through shrewd decision-making and fierce protection of their interests. And they were nodding, taking notes, asking me for clarification. "What about international market alignment?" someone asked from the Bluestream side. It wasn't Vanessa, but a gray-haired executive I recognized as their international operations director. Currently, NextGen has a stronger presence in Asian markets, while Bluestream dominates in Europe. I welcome the question. Great point. If you'll look at the projection model on page 42, we've outlined a phased approach to market integration. The first phase maintains your existing strengths in your respective regions while creating opportunities for cross-promotion. The second phase introduces a unified global strategy, but only after we've established joint operations teams in each region. The discussion continued, growing more detailed as we tackled regulatory compliance, intellectual property protections, and customer data management. I addressed each topic with specificity, never resorting to vague assurances or corporate jargon. When I didn't have an immediate answer, I acknowledged it openly. That's a nuanced question about EU data regulations, I said when challenged on a particular point. Rather than giving you an incomplete answer, I'd like to bring in our compliance specialist to address it properly. I nodded to Sarah, our legal counsel, who presented a thorough analysis of the regulatory landscape. This transparent approach seemed to build trust. Even the most skeptical executives began to engage more constructively. I felt empowered, not because I was proving anything to Vanessa, but because I was standing in a room where my voice mattered, where my value was defined by my competence, not by outdated family gossip. During a brief break to review some financial projections, I glanced at my aunt. She sat quietly, studying the documents before her with unusual intensity. Her earlier confusion had transformed into something else, a focused attention that suggested she was truly processing what was happening. No longer was she looking at me as her niece who needed career advice. She was seeing me as a skilled negotiator who was effectively reshaping 3 major companies. As we moved into the final hours of negotiation, tensions rose again. The last points were often the most contentious, details about profit-sharing formulas and performance benchmarks that could significantly impact future earnings. The earnout structure seems weighted in Apex's favor, Parker objected, pointing to a clause in the draft agreement. I understand your concern, I responded calmly. Let's examine the numbers together. I walked through the calculation model step by step, explaining the reasoning behind each variable. The structure actually creates balanced incentives for all parties. If Bluestream exceeds performance expectations, your shareholders receive additional compensation above the baseline. Parker studied the numbers, then nodded reluctantly. I see your point. It's more nuanced than I initially thought. By late afternoon, we had resolved most of the major sticking points. The room felt different, the early tension replaced by the collective energy of people on the verge of creating something significant together. Even Vanessa had contributed several substantive points about marketing integration, her professional expertise showing through despite her personal discomfort. I believe we've addressed all the essential elements, I said, reviewing our progress. The legal teams will need to finalize the language on several points, but we've reached consensus on the framework. Unless there are other concerns, I suggest we move toward preliminary approval. James Wilson, who had been content to let me lead the negotiations, now stood. Before we conclude, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary work Emily has done in bringing us to this point. When we began discussions 3 months ago, many thought this merger was too complex to execute. Emily saw the potential where others saw obstacles. His unexpected praise caught me off guard. I maintained my professional demeanor, but felt a surge of pride. Not because I needed validation, but because I had genuinely earned it through methodical, diligent work. The room listened. These weren't just industry veterans, they were billionaires. And they were nodding, taking notes, asking me for clarification. Even Catherine Liu, known for her ruthless business acumen, seemed impressed by the thoroughness of our approach. As the formal negotiation concluded, people stood, shook hands, and engaged in the kind of relaxed conversation that follows a productive meeting. I gathered my materials, accepting congratulations from several executives who approached me. I glanced at my aunt briefly during this transition. She sat silently, staring at her untouched coffee, her face pale. I wondered what was running through her mind. Regret? Embarrassment? Maybe disbelief. Whatever it was, I let it be. I had no interest in humiliation. The real power was in showing her what she never bothered to imagine I could become. The deal wasn't just about business success, it represented personal vindication. Not in a petty way, but in the profound satisfaction of knowing I had built something substantial, something that couldn't be dismissed with a condescending comment at a family dinner. As I closed my portfolio and prepared for the final handshakes, I realized I had finally stepped fully into my own power. After the deal was finalized, sealed with handshakes and applause, the room gradually emptied as executives departed for evening flights or downtown dinner reservations. I stayed behind, gathering my materials and making notes for tomorrow's debrief with our legal team. The setting sun cast long shadows across the conference room, painting the walls with warm amber light. Outside the windows, Boston's skyline began to twinkle as offices lit up against the darkening sky. James stopped by on his way out, briefcase in hand. "You're not coming to celebrate?" "The team's heading to Oak Lawn Bar in an hour." I smiled. "I'll join you shortly. Just need to organize these notes while everything's fresh in my mind." He nodded, understanding my methodical nature. "Don't work too late. You've earned a glass of champagne today." He paused at the door. "Oh, and Emily? Parker wants you to lead the integration committee. Said he was impressed by your strategic vision and diplomatic approach." His words, not mine. "Really? That's unexpected." "Not to me," James replied with a knowing smile before disappearing into the hallway. The room fell quiet. I stood alone at the head of the table, running my fingers along the polished wood. 6 months of preparation had culminated in today's success. The merger would transform all 3 companies, creating new opportunities and challenges. And I would be at the center of it, guiding the integration process. Lost in thought, I didn't immediately notice Vanessa's return. She stood in the doorway, her crimson blazer vivid against the muted tones of the room. She had removed her statement necklace, and her perfectly styled hair now showed signs of a long, stressful day. Without the audience of executives around us, she seemed smaller somehow, less certain. "Everyone's gone to dinner," I said, breaking the silence. She nodded, stepping into the room. "I told David I'd catch up with him later." She moved toward the windows, gazing out at the city. "Nice view." "It is," I agreed, continuing to organize my papers. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. Years of dismissive comments and condescending glances had built a wall between us, one I had no obligation to tear down. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "How long have you been doing this? Leading negotiations?" "About 3 years." "Working at Apex?" "Almost 4. "For years," she repeated quietly. "And you never mentioned it at Christmas or Thanksgiving." I slipped my notes into my portfolio. Would it have mattered? The question hung in the air between us. We both knew the answer. "I had no idea," she said finally, trailing off. Her eyes searched mine, perhaps hoping I'd explain myself or lessen the sting of the moment. But this wasn't about making her feel better. It wasn't about revenge either. It was simply the natural consequence of her own assumptions. I simply smiled. "I know. You never asked." She flinched slightly at my words, recognition flickering across her face. How many family gatherings had passed where she'd talked endlessly about her accomplishments, her connections, her social climbing, never once genuinely inquiring about my life. "You're good at this," she admitted, gesturing toward the table where we'd spent hours negotiating. "Really good." Even David was impressed, and he's not easily impressed. "Thank you," I said, accepting the compliment without embellishment. I didn't need her validation, but I wouldn't reject it either. Vanessa moved closer, settling into a chair near where I stood. "Did you know I was going to be here today? At the negotiation?" I closed my portfolio. "I saw your name on the attendee list last week." "And you didn't warn me? Give me a heads up." I raised an eyebrow. "Why would I? This was a business meeting, not a family reunion." She laughed unexpectedly, though the sound held a note of discomfort. "God, that was humiliating. Introducing you to colleagues as my secretary niece, only to watch you take the head seat 5 minutes later." "That wasn't my intention," I said honestly. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." "I know." She looked down at her manicured hands. "That almost makes it worse, doesn't it? You weren't plotting some elaborate revenge." You were just doing your job. Brilliantly, I might add. I remained silent, letting her process the moment in her own way. All those years, she continued, her voice softer now. All those comments about you answering phones, about you needing to find a real career. And here you are, orchestrating a $70 million merger while I'm still clawing my way up at Bluestream. We chose different paths, I said, neither apologizing for my success nor diminishing hers. Yes, we did. She looked at me directly now. Yours was harder, wasn't it? No family connections, no shortcuts. Just pure talent and hard work. I hadn't expected this level of self-awareness from her. It caught me off guard. Everyone's path has its challenges. She nodded slowly, then stood. Your parents don't know either, do they? About all this. They know I work in finance. They know I'm happy. I shrugged. The details didn't seem important. Because of me, she stated flatly. Because I would have found a way to diminish it. I didn't confirm or deny her statement, but my silence was answer enough. Vanessa gathered her purse and jacket. Well, I won't diminish it now. What you did today was impressive, Emily. Truly. She paused, seemingly struggling with what to say next. I'm sorry. For a lot of things. Her apology hung in the air, unexpected and undemanded. I hadn't come here seeking reconciliation or acknowledgement. I'd simply come to do my job. Yet here it was, a moment of genuine recognition from the person who had spent years undermining my confidence. Thank you, I said quietly. She looked at me for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away. I watched her go, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, growing fainter as she disappeared down the hallway. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't need validation or an elaborate apology. Her silence, her recognition, was enough. The expression on her face, the realization, was more powerful than any confrontation I could have planned. I gathered my things and switched off the conference room lights. Outside, Boston had fully transformed into its nighttime self, a glittering landscape of buildings and streetlights. I texted my team that I'd meet them at the Oak Lawn Bar in 20 minutes, then slipped my phone into my pocket and headed for the elevator. As I descended to the lobby, I thought about the unexpected turn the day had taken. I'd come prepared for a business victory, not a personal reckoning. Yet somehow, both had happened simultaneously. The professional triumph felt sweeter for having been witnessed by someone who had never believed in me. Not because I needed her approval, but because it closed a chapter that had remained unresolved for too long. The elevator doors opened to the bustling hotel lobby. A few late-arriving executives hurried past, checking watches and phones. At the bar, I caught a glimpse of David Parker and his team celebrating what they surely viewed as a successful negotiation. Vanessa wasn't among them. Outside, the spring evening was pleasantly cool. I paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. Something had shifted today, not just in how Vanessa saw me, but in how I saw myself. The girl who had once agonized over family dinners, who had braced herself for cutting remarks and condescending smiles, seemed very far away now. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of the Oak Lawn Bar. As we pulled away from the curb, I gazed back at the Hilton one last time. Inside those walls, I had finally stepped fully into the person I'd been becoming all these years, someone whose worth wasn't determined by family opinion or outdated expectations, but by her own achievements and character. The silent revelation wasn't just Vanessa's. It was mine too. That night, I walked out of the Oak Lawn Bar into the crisp evening air with a sense of peace. Not pride, not revenge, just calm. The celebration with my team had been perfect, champagne toasts, shared laughter, and genuine camaraderie. But now, as midnight approached and Boston quieted, I wanted solitude to process the day's events. I decided to walk home despite the late hour. My apartment in Back Bay was just 20 minutes away, and the night was clear, the air carrying that distinct spring scent of possibility. The city felt different tonight, or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Each step on the familiar sidewalks seemed to affirm something I had always known, but had only now fully realized. I had built something real from the ground up. No one had handed me shortcuts. No one had clapped for me along the way. And that was fine. I didn't need the applause. The journey from answering phones to leading multimillion-dollar negotiations had been arduous, but entirely mine. Each promotion earned through late nights and innovative solutions. Each step forward the result of careful planning and quiet determination. As I crossed the public garden, moonlight silvered the pathways and cast gentle shadows beneath the trees. I paused by the lagoon, watching moonlight ripple across the still water. The encounter with Vanessa kept replaying in my mind, not her initial condescension or even her eventual apology, but that moment of realization when she truly saw me for the first time. "I had no idea," she'd said, her voice stripped of its usual polish. "I know," I'd replied. "You never asked." Those 4 words contained years of family dynamics, of holidays where my life was deemed less interesting, my career less important. They weren't meant as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. And in that factual utterance lay a kind of power I hadn't fully appreciated before, the power of quiet accomplishment, of letting your work speak for itself. I continued my walk home, passing brownstones with warmly lit windows and closed boutiques that would bustle with activity come morning. A few late-night revelers stumbled past, their laughter echoing against brick facades. Boston slept and woke and lived around me, indifferent to my personal victory yet somehow part of it too. This city had been the backdrop to my transformation, its ambitious energy fueling my own. Back at my apartment, I kicked off my heels and padded across the hardwood floors to the kitchen. The space was modest, but mine, clean lines, carefully chosen furnishings, walls adorned with art I'd collected over years of business trips. I poured myself a glass of wine, a rich Cabernet I'd been saving for a special occasion, and moved to the window that overlooked Calm Avenue. The streetlights cast pools of gold on the empty sidewalks below. I sipped my wine and thought about how far I'd come from the nervous college graduate who'd accepted that first receptionist position because she needed to pay rent. I remembered wearing thrift store blazers altered to fit, eating ramen noodles to save for professional development courses, spending weekends in the library studying business strategy while friends enjoyed brunches I couldn't afford. Those early years had been lonely and difficult. I doubted myself countless times, especially after family gatherings where Vanessa's casual cruelty had reinforced my deepest insecurities. Was I really cut out for the business world? Was I fooling myself thinking I could climb the corporate ladder without connections or an Ivy League degree? But somewhere along the way, those doubts had transformed into determination. Each small success built confidence. Each challenge overcome added another brick to the foundation of self-assurance I now stood upon. The girl everyone underestimated had become the woman people listened to. And though I wouldn't seek to rub it in, I also wouldn't shrink myself ever again just to make someone else comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Congratulations again. Parker already signed the preliminary agreement. This is happening because of you." I smiled, typing back a quick thanks. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I opened my contacts and scrolled to my mother's number. It was too late to call now, but tomorrow I decided I would tell her about my actual job, about leading today's negotiation, about the integration committee I would chair. Not to boast, but because it was time to be fully known by the people who mattered to me. For years, I'd compartmentalized my life, keeping family separate from career to avoid Vanessa's judgment. But that approach had cost me something too. It had meant my parents never truly knew what I did, how I'd grown, what I'd achieved. In protecting myself from Vanessa's criticism, I'd inadvertently hidden important parts of myself from everyone else too. The next family gathering would be different. Not because I would announce my success with fanfare, but because I no longer carried the weight of their opinions. I had proven myself not to them, but to me. And when Aunt Vanessa looked at me again, I'd smile, not with bitterness, but with the quiet strength of someone who had earned every inch of her place at the table. I finished my wine and got ready for bed, tired but content. The alarm was set for 7 a.m. Tomorrow would bring new challenges with the integration committee. There was still so much work to do to ensure the merger succeeded. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about the power dynamics that had defined my relationship with Vanessa for so long. She had wielded her success like a weapon, using it to establish dominance and reinforce hierarchy. I had no interest in replicating that pattern. My success didn't need to diminish anyone else's. There was room at the table for all of us, if only we could see beyond our own reflections. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I woke before my alarm, energized despite the late night. While coffee brewed, I checked my email to find congratulatory messages from both Catherine Liu and David Parker, along with meeting requests to discuss next steps. James had forwarded a press release draft about the merger for my review. My name appeared multiple times as lead negotiator and future integration chair. 5 years ago, seeing my name in such a document would have seemed impossible. Now it felt right, the natural progression of dedicated work and strategic choices. As I sipped my coffee and prepared for the day ahead, I thought about how perception shapes reality. For years, Vanessa's perception of me had threatened to become my reality, if I had let it. Instead, I had quietly built an alternative path, one defined by my own standards and aspirations. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit, applied minimal makeup, and gathered my materials for the day. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with clear eyes and a slight smile, confident, capable, at peace with herself. She was so different from the awkward, insecure girl who had once dreaded family gatherings. Before leaving, I sent a quick text to my mother. "Free for dinner tonight? I have some news to share." Her response came immediately. "Always free for you. Everything okay?" I smiled. "Everything's great. I'll tell you all about it tonight." As I stepped outside into the morning sunshine, briefcase in hand, I felt a profound sense of alignment, of finally being the same person in all aspects of my life. No more compartmentalizing. No more hiding my light. The power wasn't in proving Vanessa wrong or in claiming superiority. The power was in authenticity, in standing firmly in my truth without apology or explanation. I hailed a taxi to the office, ready to begin the next chapter. The driver asked about my day ahead. "Important meetings," I said simply. "I'm leading a merger integration." The words flowed easily, without hesitation or qualification. Not boastful, just factual. And in that simple statement was the culmination of years of silent work, of persistent effort, of believing in possibilities others couldn't see. The power was in the silence, not the silence of things unsaid, but the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you are and what you've built. Not needing to announce it. Not requiring constant validation. Just moving forward, step by steady step, toward the horizon of your own choosing.